In June of 1944, as rain soaked the soil of Normandy, a seemingly insignificant bridge over the Douve River held the fate of the D-Day beaches in its grasp. Control that bridge, and the German forces could slice through to the Allied beachheads like a knife through butter. The Germans understood this perfectly. Confident in their strength and numbers, 700 of them advanced toward the bridge with a sense of inevitability. On the other side of that objective, waiting in silence, stood only 40 American soldiers. Their orders were stark and simple: ensure that neither the Germans nor the bridge would survive. Those Americans weren't ordinary troops. They weren't polished, rule-following soldiers. They were the kind of men who made military police whisper and commanding officers curse behind closed doors. Their behavior was outrageous, their manners non-existent, and their discipline questionable. Yet when they were dropped behind enemy lines, these men didn't just complete their missions. They achieved results that were almost impossible to believe. The Germans were about to learn just how dangerous and unpredictable these men could be. These 40 soldiers were known as the Filthy 13, a group infamous for their wild ways and unshakable courage. They didn't care about rules, appearances, or approval. They cared only about one thing: winning the war on their terms. Their story really began with one man, Jake McNiece, who would become the heart and soul of this unorthodox band. Jake McNiece's upbringing during the Great Depression forged him into a survivor. From the age of 10, he worked to help his family get by. He learned how to hunt, fish, and fend for himself, growing into a physically strong and mentally tough young man. When he returned to school, his drive and grit stood out. In high school, he played football and took on a job as a fireman. But it wasn't just his toughness that defined him. It was his fierce independence and his refusal to bow to anyone. He didn't back down from anyone, whether in a fight or on the field. He had a natural instinct to protect those who couldn't protect themselves and took pride in doing things his own way. One teacher would later describe him as a person who wasn't even afraid of the devil and constantly acted against the norm. This fearlessness and willingness to challenge the status quo made him the perfect candidate for the Army's newest and most daring experiment: airborne troops. Inspired by the German paratroopers who had shown the potential of airborne warfare, the U.S. military began forming its own units designed to drop soldiers deep into enemy territory. It was an incredibly dangerous job, and the training was brutal. Out of every 1,000 men who wanted to earn parachute wings, only 10 made it. It required strength, stamina, and a complete disregard for fear. McNiece thrived in that environment. He didn't want to march across battlefields. He wanted to drop straight into the chaos. To McNiece, the world of the paratrooper was everything he craved. It was raw, violent, unpredictable, and built for fighters who didn't like to be told what to do. When he got to Camp Taco in Georgia, he found a group of like-minded men who called themselves the Dirty Five. They were troublemakers, always challenging authority, missing roll calls, starting bar fights, and ignoring orders. One time, a ridiculous argument over a stick of butter with a mess officer almost got McNiece kicked out of the Army. But his skills were undeniable. His superiors recognized that he was more than just a problem. They knew he was the kind of man they would need when things got rough. One commander even said there would come a time when everyone would be glad to have McNiece on their side. He wasn't the kind of leader who inspired with speeches or polished uniforms. He led through action, instinct, and the kind of confidence that made others follow him into hell if needed. As time went on, more men joined him, and the Dirty Five grew into something larger and even more dangerous: the Filthy 13. They were officially designated as the 1st Demolition Section of the 506th Regiment, 101st Airborne Division. But everyone knew them by their reputation. In a training camp in England, while most American troops were preparing for the D-Day invasion with strict discipline and focus, the Filthy 13 were training in their own chaotic style for a much more hazardous mission. Before the invasion, McNiece pulled a stunt that nearly got him discharged. During a demolition exercise, he wired a tree to explode when another soldier passed by. The explosion caused confusion and panic, and the entire unit was locked up temporarily. But no one in the group betrayed McNiece. They stuck together, and soon they were back in action, ready to take on the mission ahead. Their command knew that despite their misbehavior, the unit was crucial to the operation's success. They couldn't be replaced. Others in the military began to hear about the Filthy 13 and wanted in. Jack Hawkeye Womer was one of them. He had served with the Provisional Ranger Battalion and had always sought out the toughest, most dangerous roles, especially anything involving explosives. When McNiece reviewed his background, he knew Womer belonged with them. The moment Womer was offered a place in the unit, he accepted without hesitation. He didn't want safety or rules. He wanted to fight where it mattered most, alongside men who lived on the edge and didn't flinch in the face of danger. As the crew led by Jake McNiece grew in number, the group began to change in image and spirit. With the invasion drawing near, McNiece began to dress in a way that made him look even more fearsome. He painted his face and styled his hair into a mohawk, saying it was connected to his Native American heritage. Whether that was fact or not didn't matter much. What mattered was the message. His father once observed that his son was leaning into the idea that if their enemies already thought American paratroopers were wild and dangerous, then presenting themselves as even more unhinged would only strengthen that fear. It was all about psychological warfare, looking like warriors, acting like warriors, and making sure everyone knew it. The Filthy 13 were no longer just another group of soldiers. Word of their fearless and chaotic energy spread fast. By the time they took off for Normandy, newspapers were already publishing photos of them in full war paint, their faces smeared with black streaks, hair cut in wild styles, eyes burning with determination. To many, they seemed like troublemakers, but they were much more than that. These men had found a rhythm that worked under loose command. They didn't wait around for orders when instincts would do. They acted fast, took risks, and had no fear of the consequences. Their task was clear. They were sent to destroy German supply lines, sabotage enemy movements, and fight as hard and long as needed. On the night of June 5, 1944, they sat packed into a C-47 Skytrain aircraft, faces smeared with paint, silent and waiting. Their destination was behind enemy lines in France. Their mission was to take out the bridges crossing the Douve Canal, and then secure the main bridge to block German reinforcements from reaching the coast. Success would be critical to the larger D-Day landings that were set to begin at dawn. McNiece had selected the men himself. There were 20 of them now. He knew the cost of war. Many of them wouldn't be coming back. At 11:00 p.m., their plane joined hundreds of others flying across the English Channel. For a short while, the journey was uneventful. But soon, the night sky lit up with the deadly glow of enemy fire. German anti-aircraft batteries had found them. Flak bursts rocked the aircraft. The pilots fought to dodge the worst of it, weaving through clouds of black smoke. The danger was immediate and overwhelming. Lieutenant Charles Mellon, the official leader of the Filthy 13, was hit as he tried to exit the plane. There was no time to process what had just happened. Another explosion tore through the aircraft. James Piccadilly Willie Green, one of McNiece's closest companions, jumped next. But disaster struck again. His parachute was shredded midair by enemy fire. The wrecked fabric slammed into the jump door, jamming the exit and trapping the others inside. Thinking fast, Green worked to clear the mess, desperate to make way for the rest of the unit. The aircraft groaned, its engines damaged, ready to fall from the sky. McNiece pushed past the chaos, shoved Green aside, and dove out of the door. Moments later, the plane exploded behind him, fire lighting up the darkness. Debris rained down across the countryside. Half of the team never made it out alive. McNiece hit the ground with brutal force, far from where he was supposed to land. He was now alone in enemy territory, more than 8 miles off target. He had no idea how many of his men had survived. Gunfire crackled nearby. He began moving through the shadows, carefully trying to regroup. Eventually, he found a few members of his team. They weren't alone. About a dozen other paratroopers, scattered from their own units, had landed nearby and joined them. The Germans were already patrolling the area, searching for intruders. In the stillness, the Americans recognized a familiar sound, the sharp pop of an M1 Garand rifle. It served as a signal. The paratroopers used the sound of their own weapons to find one another in the dark. When they returned fire, the Germans' distinct Mauser rifles revealed their positions. The fight was on, even before the sun rose. By morning, the scale of the disaster became clearer. Casualties were mounting. Roland "Frenchy" Baribeau, a brave volunteer from Canada, had been hit and would not survive. Robert Cohn, their medic, was also struck and taken prisoner. The Germans never realized he was Jewish, which likely saved his life. He would spend almost a year in a prison camp before the Russians arrived and freed him. Meanwhile, McNiece believed his best friend Willie Green had died, either killed in the explosion or doomed by the failure of his parachute. The Army thought the same and sent a death notice to Green's family. When McNiece finally left Normandy, only 2 original members of the Filthy 13 were with him, Jack Agnew and Jack Womer. The rest were gone, either captured, killed, or still missing. Some wouldn't be located until much later. As for Lieutenant Mellon, his story hadn't ended with the initial gunfire. When they found him, he was still alive, bearing wounds from bullets to his arm and leg. Those hits hadn't stopped him. He had kept going, refusing to quit. The Filthy 13 carried out their mission with a kind of brutal precision. They moved like shadows through enemy lines, carrying explosives and determination. One by one, they targeted and destroyed the smaller bridges crossing the Douve Canal. Each blast cut German routes and slowed reinforcements, meant to stop the Allied invasion. But their most important objective still remained, the main bridge. Taking that bridge could change everything. Holding it would be even harder. And if holding wasn't possible, they were to destroy it. There was no other option. McNiece and his team set up on one side, waiting for the enemy's response. It came quickly. German troops poured in from across the canal, opening fire with rifles, machine guns, and heavy artillery. The Americans held their position for 3 grueling days, fighting back with whatever they had. Ammo was precious. Every shot counted. McNiece's men fired only when it mattered. As the 3rd day dragged on, their situation looked hopeless. But the final blow didn't come from the Germans. It came from their own command. With no word from the Filthy 13 and no signs of movement, the U.S. military assumed the worst. They believed the bridge had been lost. So they called in an airstrike. P-51 Mustangs roared across the sky, guns blazing. They hit both sides of the canal, cutting down anything that moved. Then came the bombs. Explosions shattered the bridge, sending pieces crashing into the water below. McNiece and his team dove to the ground, bracing for impact as friendly fire destroyed the very target they had fought so hard to hold. When the smoke finally cleared and the ground quieted, they rose from the rubble, shaken, battered, but still standing. The bridge that had once been their mission's objective no longer existed, reduced to twisted metal and memories. Yet their mission itself hadn't ended. 2 more grueling days passed in the cold and wet, but the war had shifted. The Germans, having been pushed back and failing to break the Allied front at the beaches, were now retreating in confusion. A group of over 700 German soldiers found themselves cornered in a flooded plain dangerously close to McNiece and his men. The Filthy 13, now joined by stray American paratroopers scattered during the chaos, had grown to a fighting force of 40. They were still outnumbered nearly 20-1. But numbers didn't scare McNiece. They had been through worse, and they knew what they were capable of. Their instincts sharpened. Their eyes locked on the horizon. They waited for the inevitable clash. Before the first shot could be fired, a surprising turn of events took place. A German messenger stepped forward, carrying a white flag. The enemy commander, recognizing the tenacity of the Americans, made an offer: surrender, and they would be shown mercy. McNiece didn't need a second to think. He found the idea laughable. Giving up was never part of their code. Instead, he turned the offer on its head. He sent his own reply. If the Germans wanted, machine guns unleashed relentless fire, tearing through the front lines. Mortar rounds screamed from above, exploding in clusters and ripping through entire squads. The German formation faltered almost immediately, stunned by the sheer power of the response. But the Filthy 13 didn't stop there. They pressed the attack, continuing to fire with unrelenting accuracy and intensity. One by one, the enemy fell or fled. The few survivors of the initial wave didn't stay long. They ran, terrified and broken. By the end of the confrontation, the outcome was clear. The Filthy 13 had annihilated an entire German battalion. Victory was theirs. The bridge they had once guarded was gone, but so too was the threat. The men who had once been considered an unruly bunch of outsiders had proven themselves to be far more. They had become a tight, efficient, lethal unit, experts in sabotage, fearless in battle, and now legendary in name. Word of their actions spread quickly. Reinforcements joined them, and their reputation grew with every new mission. Military reports painted a vivid picture of their ferocity. The publication Stars and Stripes described them as ruthless warriors soaked in German blood. The message was clear. Pity any Nazi soldier unlucky enough to cross their path. Even though new faces joined the squad and the structure evolved, the spirit of the Filthy 13 remained untouched. They were still defined by their boldness, their refusal to quit, and their unshakable loyalty to one another. And soon, a new challenge awaited them, one even more daring than what they had faced before. They had already cut a destructive path through Normandy, leaving chaos in their wake. Now, their mission turned toward a bold new operation, Market Garden. This was to be the largest airborne assault of the entire war. The strategy was ambitious. Airborne troops would drop deep into enemy territory and secure vital bridges before ground forces arrived, creating a corridor into Nazi-held Holland. The Filthy 13's task was deceptively simple, but carried extreme risk. They would jump behind enemy lines, capture critical waterways, and hold the city of Eindhoven. What set them apart from typical units was their independence. They didn't operate under the typical chain of command. There was no official leader barking orders. It was McNiece and his men, relying on trust, experience, and instinct. As their aircraft soared over the channel, slicing through the skies past Jersey and Guernsey, McNiece gathered the team to review the plan. He kept things clear and direct. Everyone knew their role. They were to land, rally fast, and move on their objective without delay. There was no room for second-guessing. The parachute drop was rough, as expected, but chaos didn't throw them off. They hit the ground running, found each other quickly, and got to work. While the rest of the operation began falling apart, paratroopers cut off, key bridges slipping back into enemy hands. The Filthy 13 received a critical order: hold the 3 major bridges over the Eindhoven Canal at all costs. The mission had been estimated to take almost a week, but thanks to relentless pressure from the 506th, 501st, and 502nd Regiments, the objectives were secured far ahead of schedule. In just a day and a half, they had taken control of the waterways, the bridges, and the city itself. Knowing the Germans would launch counterattacks, McNiece and his men dug in. They held their ground fiercely. The battle for Market Garden overall would go down in history as a failure. But no one could say the same about the Filthy 13. Where many had been forced to retreat, they had stood firm. They secured what they were sent to take and never gave it back. By December 1944, the Filthy 13 had become more than a war story. They were now a symbol of what it meant to fight without fear. Their reckless edge, once questioned, had become their strength. Commanders now saw them not just as demolition experts, but as the go-to solution for the most dangerous tasks. It was time for them to take on a new identity. They became Pathfinders, the first to drop into the darkness of enemy territory, landing alone to guide the rest of the paratroopers safely to the ground. It was an honor, but a grim one. Pathfinders faced incredible odds. Most never returned. The job came with an 80% expected casualty rate. There were no volunteer speeches or dramatic requests. Command knew exactly who they needed. They looked for soldiers who didn't flinch, who didn't ask questions, who didn't stop moving, even when everything around them burned. That description fit McNiece perfectly. When he was approached for the mission, he agreed without hesitation. The others didn't need explanations. They saw their leader preparing, and they followed. No one asked why. No one hesitated. One by one, they joined him, fully aware of the risk. One of McNiece's close friends later reflected on his character. He described McNiece as the kind of man people naturally followed in combat. He didn't just lead, he set the standard. He didn't look for show-offs or talkers. He wanted people who did the job, no matter how hard it was. The newly selected Pathfinders were sent to the 9th Troop Carrier Command in Chalgrove, England. It was a new kind of war for them. Less about holding positions, more about precision and timing. Their mission would be to survive the drop, hit the ground running, and light the way for others, all while being hunted. When McNiece reported in, he met Captain Frank Brown. Brown took one look at him and recognized a natural leader. He immediately assigned him the role of acting first sergeant, and McNiece didn't waste time. He trained the men intensely, drilling them until every move was muscle memory. There was no room for hesitation, no margin for error. They had to be faster than the enemy and smarter than the confusion waiting below. Their next major trial would test everything they'd learned. It would come in the freezing darkness of Bastogne, a place where survival seemed impossible. December 23, 1944 was approaching, and the real test was just beginning. Lieutenant Schrabel Williams came to McNiece with an urgent message. The 101st Airborne Division was trapped in Bastogne, completely cut off. Their supplies were running dangerously low. Ammunition, food, and medical resources had nearly run out. A resupply mission had to be carried out, and McNiece and his team were chosen to do it. For McNiece, this would be his third combat jump, and the danger was more intense than anything he had faced before. Major Brown had handpicked McNiece for this mission. Ever since Normandy, McNiece had proven himself both tactically sharp and technically sound. There wasn't much time for a full debrief. On the tarmac, just before boarding, the flight commander unfolded a map and pointed to a small spot marked Bastogne. That tiny dot represented the heart of the crisis. The commander told them that the division was surrounded and completely isolated. They hadn't been heard from in 2 days, and no one could say for sure if they were still holding their position. All signs suggested they were. The team was being sent in to deliver essential supplies. There was nothing left but a few men hanging on, and if Bastogne fell, the enemy's blitzkrieg could break through. Holding that town meant everything. The men knew exactly what they were walking into. They had no air reconnaissance of the drop zone, no updated enemy positions, and no radio communication with the troops on the ground. It was like jumping into the unknown. To increase their chances of mission success, McNiece proposed splitting his team into 2 groups of 20 men each. That way, if one aircraft was lost, the other group could still try to carry out the operation. McNiece's group would go first and signal the second wave once the area was secure. He planned to use orange smoke as a signal for the next group to follow. The plane's engines roared as it approached the drop zone. Inside, the tension was high. Then the green light blinked on. The jumpmaster shouted. One by one, the men moved toward the door, hearts pounding. McNiece was the first to leap, diving into the icy wind that tore at him from all sides. His parachute opened, the force jerking him back as he floated down in darkness. He landed hard, rolled, and quickly unstrapped himself, his eyes scanning the area for danger. It was quiet, too quiet. There was no gunfire, no enemy in sight. They had landed on the outskirts of Bastogne. Without wasting time, the men moved fast, securing the area with weapons ready. McNiece checked the perimeter and decided it was time. He pulled the orange smoke grenade and tossed it. It hissed and filled the air with a bright signal for the second stick to come in. But something went wrong. The second aircraft misjudged the drop. Its men came down directly on top of McNiece's team. Parachutes tangled. Bodies landed in a heap. It was chaos. There was no time to sort it out carefully. They were deep in enemy territory. McNiece called out quickly, organizing everyone into action. One man had been lost in the landing, but the rest of them were alive. Jack Agnew, one of McNiece's most experienced men, had made it down with the team. Agnew had already faced hell in Normandy and other brutal campaigns, but this mission would push him even further. Within hours of landing, Agnew was hit by enemy fire while setting up a defensive position. He was wounded, but the mission had to continue. The goal was still clear: get the supplies through and hold the line. For the next 5 days, the team endured relentless pressure. Over 600 aircraft dropped badly needed supplies: ammunition, fuel, rations, and medicine. All of it made it to the ground thanks to McNiece and his team's coordination. They directed the drops, held the enemy at bay, and gave the 101st the lifeline they desperately needed. The Germans didn't let up. Their counterattacks were fierce and unending. But McNiece's team, known as the Filthy 13, held strong. Through it all, they made sure the defenders of Bastogne stayed in the fight. Their efforts in those critical early days of the mission played a vital role in defending the town and ultimately helped change the tide of the larger battle in the Ardennes. What they accomplished wasn't just about grit. It was about training, trust, and their ability to think on their feet. These men had jumped right into the fire, carrying hope and survival in every supply they delivered. They refused to let Bastogne fall. They refused to let their brothers down. For a brief but crucial moment, their success held the line. James F. Piccadilly Willie Green, one of their own, had been listed as killed in action. But that wasn't the whole story. In truth, Willie had survived. Captured by the Germans, he was marched through enemy-occupied towns and shuffled from camp to camp. When he finally emerged from captivity, he weighed just 82 pounds. Years later, McNiece was shocked to learn that Willie was alive. He had spent decades thinking his friend had perished in that mission. When he received the call confirming Willie's survival, his voice trembled with disbelief. He said he always thought Piccadilly Willie had gone down with the plane, that he had died with the ship. To McNiece, Willie had been one of the best friends he ever had. The story of the Filthy 13 became legend. Their boldness, their raw courage, and their unorthodox tactics inspired the 1967 film asterisk, The Dirty Dozen asterisk. That story, partly drawn from McNiece's own memoirs, immortalized their fight. In the film, Lee Marvin portrayed a character based on McNiece. Long after the war, McNiece received France's Legion of Honor, Chevalier class, in recognition of his service. But the legacy of the Filthy 13 didn't stop with Hollywood or medals. Their way of fighting changed warfare forever. Modern elite units like the Army Rangers, SEAL Team 6, and Delta Force took lessons from their playbook. Whether it was Operation Just Cause in Panama, the Battle of Mogadishu in 1993, the raid to kill Osama bin Laden in 2011, or operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, echoes of the Filthy 13 could be seen. Speed, surprise, daring, and the courage to fight behind enemy lines. Those were their trademarks, and special forces across the world now use them. What truly defined them wasn't just tactics. It was their relentless spirit, their fearlessness, their refusal to back down, and the way their very name sent chills down the spine of any enemy who knew what was coming.